Have you ever casted a heavy lure for 10 straight hours, your shoulder screaming in pain, completely convinced that the lake is entirely dead? And then, out of absolutely nowhere, the water explodes. You catch a massive trophy, your buddy catches one, the entire bay goes crazy, and then, exactly 30 minutes later, it all shuts down completely. Sounds familiar, right? Welcome to the biggest mystery in trophy fishing. Today, we are breaking down the legendary 30-minute feeding window. We are going to completely destroy the traditional advice your grandfather taught you about waking up at dawn. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will look at the water completely differently, and you will finally understand the exact reason why you go home empty-handed 99% of the time. But before we get into the science of a monster predator, I have a question for you to argue about in the comments. Do you believe big fish are extremely smart, or are they just incredibly lazy? Let me know below, and let us dive into the truth. To truly understand this, we have to look at why this topic drives fishermen absolutely crazy. We are creatures of habit. If a guy caught a huge fish 20 years ago at sunrise on a red spoon, he will throw a red spoon at sunrise for the rest of his natural life. We lock ourselves into these stubborn routines, grinding away on empty water, believing that if we just cast enough times, we will eventually get lucky. But hope is not a strategy. The reason thousands of anglers do the exact same thing for years without catching a true giant is because they are applying small fish logic to a completely different species. A massive predator plays by a completely different set of biological rules. Until you break those old habits and understand the environmental triggers that actually open their feeding window, you are just blindly throwing metal into the dark. Picture this exact scenario. You are sitting in your boat, the fog is rolling off the water, and you cannot even feel your fingers because it is so cold. You have been told your entire life that you need to be on the lake before the sun comes up to catch a monster. The old-timers at the bait shop swear by it. They tell you that if you are not casting by 5 in the morning, you might as well stay in bed. But let me tell you a harsh truth that might hurt your pride. That early morning grind is mostly a myth when it comes to the real river monsters. You are out there freezing, making cast after cast into the dark, while the biggest fish in the lake is completely dormant. They are not waking up just because your alarm clock went off. We have been brainwashed into thinking the early bird gets the worm. But a massive apex predator is not a bird, and it does not care about worms. They operate on their own biological clock, driven by completely different factors than a sunrise. So while you are wearing out your shoulder on your 500th cast, that giant is just sitting in the weeds, resting and waiting for the real dinner bell to ring much later in the day. To understand the mythical 30-minute feeding window, you first have to understand what a true trophy actually is. We are talking about a fish that weighs 20 pounds or more. A fish like that does not behave like a juvenile. Small fish are like teenagers. They run around, burning energy, eating constantly just to survive and grow. But a giant is a completely different animal. It is lazy, calculated, and extremely efficient. It knows exactly how many calories it costs to chase down a meal, and it will not move an inch if the math does not add up. A predator of that size can eat one large meal and then sit absolutely still on the bottom for 3 or 4 days, digesting its food. It has no reason to swim around, inspecting your lures just for fun. When you realize that you are hunting a creature that spends 95% of its life in a state of almost total inactivity, the 30-minute window starts to make a lot of sense. You're not trying to convince a hungry fish to eat. You are trying to intersect with a perfectly tuned biological machine during the very brief moment it actually decides to turn its engines on. So where did this idea of a strict 30-minute window even come from? It comes from decades of frustrated fishermen looking at their watches. You know exactly how it happens. You cast for 8 straight hours with absolutely zero action. The water looks dead. You are convinced the lake is completely empty. And then, suddenly, chaos erupts. You catch a massive fish. 5 minutes later, your buddy catches one. You see another guy across the bay netting a giant. The entire lake just explodes with activity. And then, exactly 30 minutes later, someone flips a switch and the lake goes completely dead again. The water goes flat, the bites stop, and you are left standing there wondering what just happened. This shared experience is what created the legend. It happens so consistently that people started believing these predators have a synchronized watch. But the truth is much deeper than a simple time frame. It is not magic, and it is not a scheduled appointment. It is a perfect storm of environmental triggers lining up perfectly. The window feels like 30 minutes because that is exactly how long those specific triggers usually last before the environment stabilizes again. Let us talk about what happens in your head while you are waiting for this magical window to open. It is a psychological war. You are standing on the deck, throwing a lure that weighs 10 ounces. Your back aches, your wrists are popping, and the silence is deafening. After 2 hours of no bites, the doubt starts creeping in. You start thinking your lure is the wrong color. You think maybe you are retrieving it too fast, or maybe too slow. You start digging through your tackle box, changing baits every 15 minutes. But the brutal reality is that your lure choice probably has nothing to do with why you are not getting bit. The fish is literally sitting right below your boat, watching your bait go by, and it simply does not care. It is resting. But because human beings hate doing nothing, we try to solve the problem by changing our gear. We want to believe that tying on a bright green rubber bait will suddenly wake up a sleeping giant. The hardest skill to learn in trophy fishing is simply trusting your spot and having the mental endurance to keep your bait in the water until the fish decides it is time to eat. If we completely ignore the clock on our wrist, what is the actual trigger that opens this brief feeding window? The biggest secret lies in the sky, not in the water. Barometric pressure is the invisible hand that controls the entire lake. When the air pressure is high and stable, the water presses down heavily on the fish. Their swim bladders are compressed, they feel sluggish, and they sink to the bottom. They literally feel uncomfortable. But when a storm front starts moving in, the barometric pressure begins to drop. That heavy feeling lifts off their bodies. Suddenly they feel light, aggressive, and energized. This dropping pressure acts like a universal dinner bell. It is an instinct wired into their brains over millions of years. They know a storm is coming, and they know they need to fill their stomachs before the weather turns bad. This pressure drop rarely lasts all day. It happens in sharp, sudden bursts. That sudden shift in the atmosphere is what creates your 30-minute window. If you are sitting at home watching television when that pressure drops, you just missed your one and only chance to catch the king of the lake. But the big predators do not just bite because the air feels nice. They bite because their food is finally vulnerable. You have to think about the food chain. When that pressure drops, or the light changes, the tiny organisms in the water start to move toward the surface. The small baitfish follow those organisms. Suddenly, you have massive schools of thousands of baitfish leaving the safety of the deep weeds and moving into open water. Now picture our giant apex predator sitting in the shadows. It has been watching this happen. It knows that when the baitfish push up against a specific shoreline, they are trapped. The predator does not waste energy chasing one single fish all over the lake. It waits for the entire school to be pushed into a corner. When the bait is perfectly positioned, the giant strikes. The feeding window is violently fast because it only takes the big fish a few minutes to crash into the school, swallow a massive meal, and retreat back into the dark. By the time the baitfish scatter and hide again, the window is permanently closed. The 30 minutes of magic is simply the time it takes for a brutal underwater robbery to occur. Wind is another massive piece of this puzzle that most weekend anglers completely ignore. You will see guys trying to hide from the wind, anchoring up in calm, quiet bays because it is easier to cast. But calm water is the enemy of a trophy hunter. Wind pushes the surface water, creating invisible currents underneath. These currents gather up the warm water, the plankton, and the bait, pushing them all toward one specific shoreline. As the wind increases, it also breaks up the surface of the water, killing the light penetration. This darkens the underwater world, giving the ultimate ambush predator a massive advantage. If you have been casting on a perfectly still lake all morning with zero success, pay attention to the trees. The exact moment you feel a steady breeze pick up to 15 miles per hour, your feeding window is probably about to rip wide open. The wind provides the cover they need to attack without being seen. I have seen dead lakes turn into absolute chaos in a matter of seconds, purely because the wind shifted direction and started pushing waves directly into a prominent weed line. Now, let us talk about a topic that makes a lot of old-school fishermen roll their eyes: the moon. For decades, guys who looked at lunar tables were called crazy. But modern science and tracking data have proven them absolutely right. The gravitational pull of the moon dictates the tides in the ocean, and while we do not have massive tides in freshwater lakes, that gravitational pull still deeply affects the behavior of wildlife. There are specific major and minor periods every single day, directly tied to where the moon is positioned in the sky. When the moon is directly overhead or directly underfoot, fish become noticeably more active. If you combine a major moon phase with a dropping barometer, you are no longer just hoping for a random bite. You are mathematically predicting a violent feeding window. It is common to see a massive spike in catches exactly 2 days before a full moon. The guys who consistently catch fish over 40 inches are not just getting lucky. They are sinking their time on the water with these lunar phases. They know exactly when that short, intense feeding period is biologically scheduled to happen. This brings us to one of the most shocking truths that breaks all the traditional rules: the midday surprise. You know the drill. It is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun is beating down, it is 90 degrees outside, and there is not a single cloud in the sky. Half the boats on the lake have packed up and gone home to eat lunch. The rest of the guys are taking a nap in their seats. Every book ever written tells you that the middle of a hot summer day is the worst possible time to fish. But here is the secret. During those dog days of summer, the water temperature hits its absolute peak in the early afternoon. For cold-blooded creatures, this peak temperature can drastically accelerate their metabolism for a very brief period. I cannot tell you how many true giants I have seen caught exactly at high noon, right in the middle of a blazing hot, completely flat day. It goes against everything we were taught. But while everyone else is eating sandwiches and complaining about the heat, the smartest anglers are staying intensely focused, knowing that a massive, unexpected feeding window is about to open when the rest of the world has given up. Let us look at what you are actually tying onto the end of your line. When you are hunting the king of the water, lure size is deeply connected to this short feeding window. A massive predator does not want to eat 100 tiny minnows. That takes too much effort. It wants to eat one giant meal that will sustain it for a week. That is why we throw massive rubber baits and gliders that are 12 inches long. However, throwing a bait that big is exhausting. By hour number 6, you are barely moving the bait properly. You are just dragging it through the water like a wet sock. But when that feeding window finally opens, your presentation has to be absolutely perfect. If you are throwing a giant bait but retrieving it like a zombie, the fish will just watch it pass by. The 30-minute window demands maximum focus. If you cannot maintain perfect control of a massive lure for 8 hours, you are better off throwing something slightly smaller that you can actually work correctly when the crucial moment arrives. The fish knows exactly what dying prey looks like, and it will not waste its precious 30 minutes on a meal that looks suspicious. You also have to completely reset your expectations of what a bite from a giant actually feels like. Everyone expects a massive, rod-ripping explosion. We watch too many edited videos online where the fish comes flying out of the water like a missile. But in reality, when that window opens and a true giant decides to eat, it is often terrifyingly subtle. They do not need to aggressively smash your bait. They simply open their massive mouth, flare their gills, and suck in a huge volume of water, bringing your lure right down their throat. You are reeling along, and suddenly your lure just stops. It does not jerk. It does not twitch. It just feels like you hooked a heavy, submerged log. This is the moment of truth. Most guys pause, wondering if they hit the bottom, and in that 1 second of hesitation, the fish spits the hook. When you are in that feeding window, you have to treat every single heavy feeling like it is a monster. You swing hard, driving the hooks into what feels like a solid brick wall. If you are not mentally prepared for that silent strike, you will miss the only bite you get all day. Let us dive deep under the surface and talk about the invisible walls that control these fish. The thermocline. In the summer, a lake divides itself into distinct temperature layers. The warm water sits on top, and the freezing cold water sits on the bottom. Where these two layers meet is called the thermocline. Below this line, there is often zero oxygen. Above it, the water might be too hot for a cold water predator. So these massive fish suspend right on that exact dividing line. It is like an invisible highway. If you are casting a lure that runs 5 feet deep, but the thermocline is at 20 feet, you are completely wasting your time. You could cast for 10 years and never get a bite. The 30-minute feeding window often happens when baitfish make the mistake of dipping too close to this invisible line. The predator does not have to hunt. It just waits on its highway for food to drop down. To capitalize on this, you have to know exactly how deep your lure is running. You have to put your bait directly into their living room. If you are even a few feet off, the feeding window will open and close without you ever knowing it. Fishing a giant lake blindly is a recipe for absolute failure. You have to stop looking at the water as a flat surface and start looking at it like a hunting ground. A trophy predator is an ambush artist. It wants to hide in the thickest, darkest cover available, right next to deep water. Imagine a dense wall of underwater cabbage weeds that suddenly drops off into a 30-foot dark abyss. That edge is a prime ambush point. The big fish will wedge itself into the weeds, blending in perfectly, waiting for a school of baitfish to swim past the edge. When the feeding window triggers, the giant just lunges out, grabs a meal, and slides right back into the cover. It moves maybe 10 feet total. If your boat is positioned poorly and you are casting parallel to the wrong side of the drop-off, you are out of the strike zone. You have to visualize the underwater terrain. You need to drop your lure right on the edge of that dark abyss and bring it up along the weed line, mimicking a confused baitfish separated from the school. You are basically ringing the doorbell at their house during dinner time. Modern fishing electronics have completely shattered the old myths and humbled thousands of arrogant fishermen. With the invention of forward-facing sonar, we can now look down and actually see these giant fish in real time. And what we have learned is absolutely devastating to our egos. We used to think that if we did not get a bite, there were no fish in the area. But the screen shows us the brutal truth. You can watch a massive 40-inch mark slide up right behind your lure. It follows it for 20 feet. It looks at it, smells it, analyzes it, and then simply turns around and swims away. You did not do anything wrong. The fish is just not in its feeding window. Seeing this on a screen proves that these giants are always around us. They are completely aware of our presence and our lures. They are just incredibly disciplined. Before screens, we would leave the spot thinking it was empty. Now we know better. We know that if we mark a giant, we need to stay. We need to wait it out. Because eventually, that 30-minute window will open, And that same fish that rejected your lure 3 times will suddenly turn around and destroy it. Even when the window opens, the fish still needs a reason to pull the trigger. A steady, monotonous retrieve is the easiest way to bore a predator to death. Think about how a real wounded animal moves in the water. It does not swim in a perfectly straight line at a constant speed. It darts, it stops, it shudders, and it panics. If you want to maximize that brief 30-minute period of activity, you have to incorporate erratic triggers into your retrieve. You reel steadily for 5 seconds and then suddenly give the reel handle 3 violently fast cranks. Then you completely stop and let the bait pause. That sudden burst of speed mimics a prey fish realizing it is being hunted and trying to flee. That sudden pause mimics a dying fish giving up. 90% of your strikes will happen right on that pause or right after that speed burst. It is a game of cat and mouse. You are trying to trigger an aggressive reaction strike. Even if a fish is only mildly hungry, if you make it think its meal is about to escape, its primal instincts will completely take over and force it to attack. Now we have to discuss the dark side of the feeding window, the postfrontal depression. This is the scenario every fisherman dreads. A massive thunderstorm rolls through overnight. The next morning, the sky is a brilliant, blinding blue. There is absolutely no wind, and the air is crisp and cool. It looks like a beautiful day to be on the water. But underwater, it is an absolute nightmare. The barometric pressure has skyrocketed. The fish feel terrible. They sink into the mud, lock their jaws completely shut, and refuse to move. During these high-pressure bluebird days, the traditional 30-minute feeding window might not even happen at all. They might go a full 48 hours without eating a single thing. When you are faced with these brutal conditions, you cannot fish the same way you do on a cloudy day. You have to literally drop your bait right on their nose. You have to use smaller profiles, slower movements, and fish deeper into the heaviest cover you can find. You are no longer waiting for a feeding window. You are trying to annoy a completely miserable fish into snapping at you out of pure anger. There is a strange phenomenon that happens when you finally find a spot holding a monster. The competition factor. We tend to think of these giants as lonely creatures that rule their territory by themselves. But the truth is, the best spots on the lake hold multiple big fish. A perfect ambush point is valuable real estate. When the feeding window opens, a bizarre underwater rivalry begins. Sometimes a massive fish is not even hungry, but it sees another fish moving toward your lure. Pure jealousy and territorial dominance take over. The bigger fish will aggressively attack your bait simply to steal it away from the smaller fish. This is why you will sometimes experience a window where you catch 2 or 3 massive fish in a matter of 20 minutes from the exact same weed bed. The entire pack gets fired up. The sound of a struggling fish on your line actually attracts the others. They hear the vibrations of the fight and come to investigate. If you land a giant, do not sit down and take a break. Take your picture, release it, and cast right back into the exact same spot immediately. The window is still open, and its angry roommate might be waiting. The biggest threat to your success is not the weather, the lure, or the lake. It is your own mental fatigue. Let us be brutally honest. Casting heavy gear for 8 straight hours is mind-numbing work. By the time the afternoon rolls around, you are tired, hungry, and bored. You start holding the rod lower. You stop putting action into the bait. You start staring at the trees instead of focusing on your line. You fall into a rhythm of lazy, robotic casting, and inevitably, this is exactly when the 30-minute window decides to open. A massive shadow follows your lazily retrieved lure right to the side of the boat. You do not see it until the last second. You panic. You try to do a figure 8 at the side of the boat, but you fumble it. The fish turns, gives you one final look, and vanishes into the depths. You just missed your only chance of the day because you let your guard down. trophy hunting is a game of extreme mental endurance. You have to treat your 1000th cast with the exact same focus and intensity as your first cast. If you mentally check out, the fish wins every single time. So, is it really just one single 30-minute window per day? The science and the catch records say no. It is actually much more complex. Instead of one solid block of time, the day is usually broken up into multiple, unpredictable micro-windows. You might get a 10-minute burst of activity at 9 in the morning when the wind shifts. You might get another 7-minute window at 2 in the afternoon when a small cloud covers the sun. And you might get a massive 15-minute frenzy right before a thunderstorm hits in the evening. The myth of the single 30-minute block was created by guys who only managed to stumble into one of these micro-windows and assumed it was the only one. The reality is that the lake is constantly breathing and shifting. Triggers are turning on and off all day long. This is why the guys who stay on the water from dawn until dusk consistently catch the biggest fish. They are maximizing their mathematical odds of intercepting multiple micro-windows. They do not pack up and go home just because the morning bite died. They know another window is always just a few hours away. When you finally step back and look at the big picture, you realize that catching a fish of a lifetime is never just an accident. It is a massive puzzle where every single piece has to fit perfectly. You need the right barometric pressure to make them active. You need the wind to position the bait fish. You need the moon phase to align with their biological clock. You need to position your boat perfectly on the edge of the deepest weed line. And you need the mental toughness to cast a heavy lure flawlessly for 10 hours straight without losing your focus. The 30-minute window is not a myth, but it is also not magic. It is simply the beautiful, chaotic moment when all of these environmental and biological factors collide at the exact same time. You cannot control the weather, and you cannot control the fish. But you can control your knowledge, your preparation, and your endurance. By understanding how these triggers work, you stop hoping for blind luck. You become a hunter. You put yourself in the right place, at the right time, and you wait for the trap to spring. And when that heavy strike finally hits, every second of that agonizing wait becomes entirely worth it. So, what is the ultimate takeaway from all of this? The biggest plot twist is not that the 30-minute window is a myth. The twist is that it is incredibly real, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the clock on your wall. It is driven by falling barometric pressure, shifting winds, moon phases, and bait fish migrations. You can stop exhausting yourself by blind casting for 12 hours a day. Once you understand these triggers, you can start hunting with absolute precision. This completely changes how you approach fishing. You stop hoping for luck, and you start calculating your attack. If this breakdown opened your eyes and gave you a new perspective on hunting river monsters, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and drop a comment below. I want to know, what is the strangest weather condition you have ever caught a massive fish in? Share your stories down in the comments, and I will see you on the water next time.